May 8, 1945, 8:30 in the evening. Camp Aliceville, Alabama. Obergefreiter Hans Müller set down his evening meal and shook his head in disbelief as he read the repatriation notice posted outside the mess hall. The paper trembled slightly in the humid Alabama air. Its official typeface announcing what should have been the most joyous news of his captivity. All German prisoners would be returned to their homeland within 6 months. Instead, the words felt like a death sentence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Hans stood there for a long moment, his educated mind struggling to process the cruel irony. Around him, other prisoners gathered, reading over his shoulder, their faces reflecting the same dread that twisted in his gut. The evening insects buzzed in the thick southern air, indifferent to the quiet devastation unfolding beneath the camp's bright electric lights. "Return to Germany," Hans announced to his fellow prisoners, his voice carrying none of the excitement such words should contain. His throat felt tight, constricted by emotions he'd never imagined feeling about leaving captivity. Return to what? Bombed cities, starvation, occupation by the Soviets. "They want us to leave paradise for purgatory." Feldwebel Otto Kruger pushed through the small crowd that had formed. At 42, the former farm manager from East Prussia had the weathered hands and practical bearing of a man who understood the mathematics of survival. He'd spent 2 years working on American farms, his sharp eyes calculating yields and machinery efficiency with the precision of someone who couldn't deny what the numbers told him. Otto laughed, but the sound held no humor. It was bitter, hollow, the laugh of a man confronting an absurdity too large to comprehend. 3 years ago, "I would have given anything to escape this prison camp," Otto said, gesturing at the well-maintained barracks behind them. The recreation building with its library and musical instruments visible through lit windows. "Now I would give anything to stay." He paused, his jaw working as if chewing on words too difficult to swallow. "We eat better as prisoners in America than we ever did as free men in Germany. We live better, work in dignity, and are treated with more respect than German citizens receive from their own government." The barracks filled with murmurs of agreement. These men, hardened soldiers of the Afrika Korps who had followed Rommel across the desert, now stood united in their dread of liberation. They shifted uncomfortably, some staring at their boots, others gazing toward the mess hall where dinner waited. Hot, abundant, more food than most of their families had seen in months. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Hoffmann emerged from the administration building, a letter clutched in his hand. At 35, Hoffmann had always been the adaptive one, the forward thinker who'd learned fluent English working in American factories. His linguistic gifts had opened doors his fellow prisoners couldn't access, giving him an intimate understanding of American society that went beyond surface observations. "I have written to my family," Wilhelm announced, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "I've asked them to join me here rather than wait for my return." He held up the letter as if it were evidence in a trial where he stood accused of treason against his homeland. "America offers opportunities that will never exist in Germany. Why should we abandon prosperity for poverty, freedom for oppression, hope for despair?" Silence followed his declaration. Not the silence of disagreement, but the heavy quiet of men, recognizing a truth they'd been afraid to speak aloud. Wilhelm had simply articulated what many had been thinking for months, perhaps years. Dr. Wilhelm Fischer stepped forward from the medical building, still wearing his white coat. As a captured medical officer, Fischer's professional training had given him a unique lens through which to observe their captivity. His analytical mind had documented every detail, every comparison between American medical care and what he'd known in Germany. The Americans provide medical care for German prisoners that exceeds what our own army provided for German soldiers, Fischer said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of professional assessment rather than emotion. They treat our wounded with skill and compassion, use their best medicines, and show no distinction between American and German patients in their hospital wards." He paused, removing his glasses to clean them, a habitual gesture when processing difficult thoughts. "I have participated in their university extension programs while imprisoned. I have learned more about medicine, ethics, and humanitarian care in captivity than I learned in years of German medical education." Hans looked around at his fellow prisoners, seeing his own internal conflict reflected in their faces. These men had arrived in America expecting brutal treatment, starvation, and vengeful abuse. Nazi propaganda had prepared them for concentration camps and slave labor designed to break their spirits. Instead, they had discovered abundance, opportunity, and human dignity that exceeded anything they had known in the fatherland. The transformation had been complete and irreversible. Hans remembered their arrival. How long ago was it now? 2 years? Nearly 3? The fear in their eyes as they stepped off the USS Henry Gibbons at Norfolk Naval Base, steeling themselves for the cruelty they'd been promised. The confusion when American Red Cross volunteers greeted them with coffee and sandwiches. Real Brazilian coffee, not the acorn substitute German troops had endured. Sandwiches containing more meat than most German civilians had seen in years. He remembered the train journey across America, his face pressed against the window like Otto's, watching impossible abundance roll past. Electric lights in every small town. Massive farms with machinery that dwarfed anything in Germany. Well-fed citizens going about their lives in a country that seemed blessed by some divine hand that had forsaken Europe entirely. He remembered arriving at Camp Aliceville, expecting harsh conditions, and finding barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, the recreation building with books and musical instruments, the mess hall that served portions larger than German military rations. Most of all, he remembered the treatment. Professional American guards who separated German soldiers from Nazi ideology, who shared cigarettes and asked about families, who treated them as human beings rather than subhuman enemies deserving only contempt, and then the work release program. Hens's assignment to the Johnson family farm in Iowa, where he'd expected harsh labor and found instead a family that welcomed him to their dinner table. Mrs. Johnson, including him in daily activities. The children showing him respect and curiosity instead of hatred. The grandmother teaching him English with patient kindness. Otto's voice broke through Hans's memories. "I calculate," the former farm manager said, his practical mind reducing everything to numbers, "that I eat better as a prisoner in America than my brother and his family eat as free Germans in East Prussia." His voice cracked slightly. "The mathematics are simple and damning." Wilhelm nodded, his English fluency allowing him to articulate thoughts others struggled to express. "I worked alongside colored workers in the Michigan factory. I watched them cooperate, show mutual respect, work together efficiently on complex projects." He shook his head, as if still unable to reconcile what he'd witnessed with what he'd been taught. Everything we were told about American racial conflict and social weakness, lies. All of it lies. The evening deepened around them, the Alabama heat finally beginning to ease. Inside the barracks, other prisoners were discovering the notices, and the same conversations were starting. The same dread spreading like a contagion of unwanted liberation. Hans felt the weight of his education, his writer's instinct to document, to understand, to articulate what was happening to them all. They had come to America as confident Nazi soldiers, secure in their ideological certainty, about German superiority and American decadence. Now, they were begging to remain prisoners. What? These German prisoners had experienced contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had taught them about American weakness and German superiority. After 3 years of American captivity, they had discovered a society so prosperous, so free, and so full of opportunity that returning to their homeland felt like exile from paradise. The question that haunted Hans as he stood in the warm Alabama evening wasn't, "How did we end up here?" It was something more profound, more disturbing. How did we not know? How were we so thoroughly deceived about everything we believed? But even as the question formed, Hans knew the answer would require going back to the beginning. To that day in May 1943, when they'd first stepped onto American soil, expecting brutality and discovering something that would shatter every certainty they'd ever held about the world and their place in it. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. May 15th, 1943, 2:30 in the afternoon. Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The first group of German prisoners from the Tunisia campaign stepped off the Liberty ship USS Henry Gibbons, their faces set with grim determination. Hans Müller steeled himself for what Nazi propaganda had promised: American brutality, starvation, vengeful treatment designed to break their spirits. Instead, American Red Cross volunteers greeted them with coffee, sandwiches, and cigarettes. Hans stared at the offerings in disbelief. Real Brazilian coffee, not the acorn substitute German troops had endured since 1941. Sandwiches containing more meat than most German civilians had seen in years. American cigarettes, not the harsh tobacco rations of the Wehrmacht. "This must be propaganda," Hans whispered to Otto Kruger beside him. "They feed us well initially to make us compliant. Then the real treatment begins." But as they boarded passenger trains, not cattle cars, with padded seats and dining cars, Hans's certainty began cracking. Through the windows, an impossible landscape unfolded. Every small town blazed with electric lights. Every farm displayed machinery that exceeded German agricultural equipment. Every American citizen appeared well-fed, well-clothed, blessed with abundance. Otto pressed his face against the window as they passed through Kansas, his practical mind calculating what his eyes witnessed. "Single American farms are larger than entire German agricultural districts," he muttered, his voice hollow with disbelief. "The machinery, the abundance, the scale. They lied to us about everything." The train carried them deeper into American territory, and with each passing mile, the foundations of their Nazi indoctrination crumbled a little more. The prisoners marched through the gates of Camp Aliceville, Alabama, expecting harsh conditions. What they found instead shattered their remaining expectations. Wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, central heating, recreational facilities that included libraries, sports equipment, and hobby workshops. Dr. Fisher toured the medical wing with growing astonishment, his professional eye cataloguing equipment superior to most German civilian facilities. "This cannot be real," he murmured, recording observations in his mental journal. The first mess hall meal left prisoners staring at their trays in stunned silence. More calories and nutrition than German military rations. Fresh vegetables, real meat. Portions that suggested abundance rather than scarcity. Most shocking was the treatment by American guards. An older sergeant approached Otto during evening recreation, offering a cigarette. "You got family back home?" the guard asked in broken German, his tone genuinely curious rather than mocking. Otto accepted the cigarette with trembling hands, unable to reconcile this kindness with everything he'd been taught about American cruelty. The guard spoke of his own family, showed photographs of his children, treated Otto as a human being rather than a subhuman enemy. That night, Wilhelm Hoffmann began learning English words from guards, his adaptive mind already planning for possibilities his fellow prisoners hadn't yet considered. Hans wrote a careful letter home, heavily self-censoring his descriptions, knowing his family would never believe the truth about American captivity. Summer 1943 brought the work release program. Hans found himself assigned to the Johnson family farm in Iowa, expecting brutal labor conditions. Instead, Mrs. Johnson invited him to dinner that first evening. "You'll eat with the family," she said simply, as if having an enemy prisoner at her table was the most natural thing in the world. Hans sat awkwardly at the Johnson dinner table, surrounded by children who showed curiosity instead of hatred. A grandmother who immediately began teaching him English phrases, and parents who included him in their conversation as if he were an honored guest rather than a defeated enemy. Otto operated modern dairy equipment on a Wisconsin farm, his practical mind performing constant calculations. The machinery was more advanced than anything in Germany. The productivity ratios defied everything he knew about agriculture. The 8-hour workdays, the respectful treatment, the wages paid for his labor, all of it exceeded German civilian workplace standards. Wilhelm worked alongside African-American factory workers in Michigan, directly witnessing the racial cooperation that Nazi propaganda had claimed was impossible. The integrated workforce functioned efficiently, workers showing mutual respect regardless of skin color. Each evening, the prisoners gathered back at camp to compare experiences, their conversations growing increasingly uncomfortable as they confronted the gap between propaganda and reality. "The numbers don't lie," Otto said flatly. "We live better as prisoners here than we did as free men in Germany." Fall 1943 brought morning mail call, anticipation mixed with dread. Hans opened his sister's letter with shaking hands. Her words described the Dresden firebombing aftermath, buildings reduced to rubble, civilians dead in the streets, starvation rations that left children hollow-eyed and weak. His sister's handwriting grew shaky toward the end, as if she lacked the strength to press the pen to paper. Otto read about Soviet advances threatening East Prussia, his brother's farm in the path of the Red Army. Wilhelm learned his children were malnourished, schools closed, his wife struggling to find food. That evening, the prisoners gathered in heavy silence, sharing the contents of their letters. The contrast was unbearable. They ate better as enemy prisoners than their families did as German citizens. They lived in heated barracks while their loved ones shivered in bombed buildings. They experienced abundance while Germany starved. Hans attempted to write a response describing the Iowa farm's prosperity. He tore up 3 drafts, unable to find words that wouldn't seem like cruel mockery or delusional fantasy. How could he tell his starving sister about the Johnson family's overflowing dinner table? How could he describe American abundance without sounding like he'd betrayed everything German? Wilhelm made a decision that shocked even himself. He would write to his wife, suggesting she try to bring their children to America rather than wait for his return. The mathematics of suffering versus abundance were becoming impossible to ignore. December 1944 brought an American Christmas that would complete the prisoners' transformation. The Johnson family invited Hans to their Christmas Eve celebration. He sat at their decorated table, candles flickering across faces filled with genuine warmth, and participated in prayers that spoke of peace on earth and goodwill toward all men, even enemies. The grandmother presented him with a hand-knitted scarf, her weathered hands pressing it into his with a squeeze that conveyed more than words could. "You're part of our family now," she said simply. The Johnson children gave him a drawing they'd made, showing him working alongside their father in the fields. The word "welcome" written in careful letters across the top. Otto received care packages from Strangers, a Methodist church in Alabama, a Teamsters union in Detroit, families who'd never met him but wanted to demonstrate Christian charity toward an enemy. He opened each box with trembling hands, finding small gifts, letters of encouragement, and expressions of kindness that made his throat tight with emotion he couldn't name. Wilhelm attended a factory Christmas party where integrated workers welcomed him as a colleague. They gave him small gifts, a pocket watch, family photographs, a small American flag as a keepsake. They shook his hand and wished him well, treating him with dignity that exceeded anything he'd known in Germany. That evening, the prisoners gathered to share their experiences. Many wept openly, hardened soldiers undone by unexpected grace. Dr. Fisher documented it all, recognizing that American society was embodying humanitarian principles that Nazi Germany had only propagandized. Hans attempted to write to his sister, trying to explain the inexplicable American kindness. How could he make her understand that their enemies were demonstrating the Christian values Germans claimed to represent? The words wouldn't come. Some transformations were too profound for letters. Spring 1945 brought news of Germany's collapse through multiple channels: military briefings, newspapers, anguished letters. The prisoners followed the Allied advance with complicated emotions that twisted in their chests like physical pain. Then came the newsreels, the camp's recreation hall filled with prisoners watching footage of concentration camp liberations. The projector's light cast flickering shadows across faces frozen in horror. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, mountains of emaciated corpses, walking skeletons with hollow eyes, gas chambers and crematoria. Otto bolted from his seat and vomited in the corner, his body rejecting what his eyes had witnessed. When he could finally speak, his voice was raw. "We did this. In Germany's name, we did this." Hans sat motionless, his writer's mind struggling to process the systematic evil committed by his nation. How complicit was he? He'd fought for the Wehrmacht, believing Nazi propaganda about German superiority and racial destiny. Passive participation was still participation. Wilhelm received a letter that Soviets had occupied his hometown. His family's fate was uncertain, their home likely seized. The news crystallized his determination. He would bring them to America by any means necessary. Dr. Fischer organized discussion groups to process the collective guilt, his professional ethics demanding acknowledgement of the medical atrocities committed by German doctors. His profession had been corrupted, twisted into instruments of genocide. Major Neuland documented the prisoners' reactions in reports to the War Department. Over 60% now expressed preference for remaining in America. Camp newspapers published articles admiring American democracy. Censors had to edit them to prevent the appearance of brainwashing. Hitler's death brought no celebration, only relief. Germany had deserved to lose. That truth sat heavy in their hearts. Summer 1945. VE Day had come and gone, and with it the official repatriation timeline, all prisoners home within 6 months. Hans drafted an eloquent written petition, his educated prose explaining the intellectual and moral journey he'd undertaken. He described his transformation from Nazi ideology to democratic values, articulated his understanding of human dignity and freedom, and begged for the opportunity to remain in the society that had taught him these principles. Otto submitted practical proposals for agricultural work programs, demonstrating how German prisoners could contribute to American farming. He included detailed calculations, productivity analyses, and letters of recommendation from Wisconsin farmers who vouched for his character and work ethic. Wilhelm made personal appeals to Major Neuland in fluent English, his linguistic abilities, allowing him to articulate the depth of his cultural adaptation. He was more American than German now, his values and worldview fundamentally altered by 3 years of exposure to democratic society. Dr. Fischer offered his medical expertise in service to American communities, proposing to work in underserved, rural areas where his skills could address healthcare shortages. Major Neuland interviewed each petitioner, documenting their testimonies with growing sympathy. His reports to the War Department described an unprecedented situation: enemy prisoners begging to remain imprisoned rather than return home. The transformation was genuine, systematic, and profound. But international agreements required prisoner repatriation. Each petition was systematically denied despite sympathetic consideration. The Johnson family wrote letters supporting Hans. American guards expressed genuine regret, but the machinery of international law ground forward, indifferent to individual transformation. The prisoners began preparing mentally for forced departure, their hearts heavy with the bitter irony of unwanted liberation. Fall 1945 through winter 1946 brought the repatriation process in waves. The prisoners spent their final weeks deepening relationships and memorizing lessons they'd carry home. Hans had his final dinner with the Johnson family. Mrs. Johnson served his favorite dishes, and the meal stretched late into the evening, everyone reluctant to let the moment end. When it was time to leave, the grandmother pressed her late husband's Bible into Hans's hands, a handwritten note tucked inside. "Live these principles in Germany. Be the change you wish to see." The family gave him farming tools, American agricultural manuals, and soil samples. They embraced him with tears streaming down their faces, extracting promises that he would write, that he would remember, that he would apply what he'd learned. Otto received crop seeds and detailed letters from Wisconsin farmers willing to correspond indefinitely. His employer wrote a recommendation letter so glowing it might have been written for a beloved son rather than an enemy prisoner. Wilhelm exchanged addresses with factory workers, promising to teach his children American values and work toward a democratic Germany. They gave him a small American flag, carefully folded, and photographs of integrated workforces to prove what was possible when people looked beyond skin color. Dr. Fisher compiled thick folders of medical documentation and American techniques. His papers, a blueprint for rebuilding German healthcare with humanitarian ethics at its foundation. The trains carried them to embarkation ports, and the prisoners watched the American landscape pass one final time. They were no longer men begging to stay, but ambassadors determined to transform Germany into a society worthy of American respect. Their captivity had freed them. Now they would carry that freedom home. 1965. The long-term impact of the prisoners' transformation rippled across decades. Hans returned to Bavaria and established a farming cooperative using American methods and democratic principles. The cooperative achieved productivity levels that impressed occupation authorities, becoming a regional model. American techniques applied to German soil, abundance born from lessons learned in captivity. Otto navigated the immigration process successfully, arriving in America in 1953. He became the American citizen he'd dreamed of being, working the land he'd come to love. In 1965, he published his memoir, From Captivity to Freedom, documenting his journey from Nazi soldier to American citizen. The book's final line became famous: "America didn't defeat us through force. It transformed us through example." Wilhelm successfully brought his family to America. His children grew up as American citizens, attending integrated schools, embodying the values he'd discovered during captivity. He became a successful factory manager, implementing workforce training programs that emphasize cooperation across racial lines. Dr. Fisher helped rebuild German medical practices based on American standards and humanitarian ethics. His influence shaped post-war German healthcare, ensuring that medical ethics would never again be corrupted by ideology. Former prisoners became unofficial ambassadors for American values throughout Germany. Their testimonies influenced civilian attitudes toward America, facilitated Marshall Plan acceptance, and contributed to the German-American alliance during the Cold War. Thousands immigrated to America during the 1950s, bringing skills, gratitude, and living proof that treating enemies with dignity creates strategic advantages military victory alone cannot achieve. The German-American Friendship Society now maintains archives of prisoner testimonies, documenting how humane treatment transformed hearts and changed history. The mathematics of human transformation, it turned out, were more powerful than the mathematics of military defeat. Sometimes the greatest victories come not through conquest, but through demonstrating superior values and treating enemies with dignity that reveals the emptiness of their ideology. 30 years after the war's end. Hans Müller stood in the doorway. of his modest farmhouse in Bavaria, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and amber. At 72, his hair had gone completely white, and his hands bore the permanent calluses of a man who'd spent 3 decades working the land. But his green eyes remained sharp, observant, still carrying that writer's instinct to document and understand. Behind him, in the warm kitchen, his daughter prepared dinner while his grandchildren did homework at the table. The farmhouse was simple but comfortable, built on principles of efficiency and practicality he'd learned in Iowa 3 decades earlier. The cooperative he'd established in 1946 now employed 43 families and produced yields that consistently exceeded regional averages. A car pulled into the gravel drive, American-made, and Hans felt his heart quicken with the same anticipation he'd experienced countless times over the years. He recognized the vehicle immediately. Thomas Johnson stepped out, now 65, his movements slower than Hans remembered, but his smile just as warm. Behind him emerged his son, Robert, who'd been one of the children Hans had known during his captivity. Robert was 42 now, a successful agricultural engineer who'd made this pilgrimage with his father to see the results of seeds planted so long ago. "Hans!" Thomas called out, his voice thick with emotion. They embraced in the doorway. 2 old men who'd once been enemy and captor, now bound by something deeper than nationality or the accidents of history. Hans felt tears on his weathered cheeks and made no attempt to hide them. "You came," Hans said in English that still carried the accent of his homeland. "After all these years, you came." "I promised, didn't I?" Thomas replied. "Back in 46, I promised I'd see what you built with what we gave you." Over dinner, Hans's family and the Johnsons shared stories that bridged cultures and generations. Robert described how his father had spoken of Hans for decades, how the experience of hosting a German prisoner had shaped Thomas's understanding of humanity and conflict. Hans's daughter translated for her children, ensuring they understood the significance of their guests. "My father kept your letters," Robert said, pulling out a worn folder. "Every single one you sent over 30 years. He read them to us, growing up, teaching us that former enemies can become family." Hans opened the folder with trembling hands, seeing his own handwriting from decades past. Letters describing the cooperative's first harvest, the challenges of implementing American techniques in German soil, the slow rebuilding of a shattered nation. Letters expressing gratitude that never diminished, even as years became decades. Later, as darkness settled over the valley, Hans and Thomas sat on the porch, sharing whiskey and the comfortable silence of old friends. "Sometimes I think about those days," Hans said quietly. "How close I came to spending my entire life believing the lies we were taught. If I hadn't been captured, if I hadn't been sent to America, if your family hadn't treated me with such kindness." He trailed off, the alternative timeline too terrible to contemplate. Thomas nodded, understanding. "I think about it too, about how easy it would have been to hate you, to treat you cruelly, to justify vengeance as justice. But my mother, God rest her, she wouldn't allow it. She said, 'That boy is someone's son, someone's brother. We'll treat him as we'd want our boys treated if they were captured.' Your grandmother's Bible," Hans said, gesturing toward the house. "I still have it. I read it to my grandchildren, the same passages she marked for me." The conversation drifted to Otto Kruger, who'd sent a letter just last month from his farm in Wisconsin. At 83, Otto still worked his land, still calculated yields and efficiency with the same practical mind that had first recognized American agricultural superiority. Through a train window in 1943, his memoir had been translated into multiple languages, required reading in some German schools as a testament to the power of transformation over hatred. Wilhelm Hoffmann had passed away the previous year, but his children, fully American now, continued his legacy. His factory in Detroit employed hundreds, and his integrated workforce training programs had become models for corporate America. His funeral had been attended by workers of every race and background, a living testament to the principles he'd discovered in captivity. Dr. Fisher had retired from medical practice but continued lecturing at universities about medical ethics and the dangers of ideology, corrupting humanitarian professions. His influence had shaped a generation of German physicians who understood that medicine served humanity, not political systems. We're dying off now. Thomas, Hans said, his voice carrying the weight of mortality. My generation, the ones who experienced the transformation firsthand. Soon it will only be stories, letters, memories preserved in archives. That's why Robert came, Thomas replied. Why I brought him here. So he could see with his own eyes, hear from your own mouth, understand that this wasn't mythology or exaggeration. It was real. Human beings capable of extraordinary evil can also be transformed by extraordinary kindness. Hans looked at his old friend, seeing in Thomas's weathered face the same earnest decency that had characterized his entire family. You gave me more than freedom, Thomas. You gave me a model for how human beings should treat each other. I've spent 30 years trying to live up to that example. And you have, Thomas said firmly. This cooperative, the families you've helped, the principles you've maintained, you've multiplied what you received, Hans. That's all any of us can do. The next morning, Hans gave the Johnsons a tour of the cooperative. Robert, the agricultural engineer, marveled at the efficiency of the operations, the American techniques adapted and refined for German conditions. Workers greeted Hans with genuine warmth and respect, and he knew each family by name, understood their challenges, celebrated their successes. This is what victory looks like, Robert said quietly to his father as they watched Hans explain a new irrigation system to a young farmer. Not conquest, not domination, transformation, creating allies where there were enemies, building prosperity where there was destruction. At the train station, as the Johnsons prepared to depart, Hans pressed a package into Thomas's hands. My memoir, he explained. I've been writing it for years, trying to capture what happened to us, what your family did for me. I want you to have the first copy. Thomas held the manuscript carefully, as if it was something sacred. What did you title it? The Paradise I Found in Prison, Hans replied. Because that's what it was, Thomas. Your country, your family, showed me paradise when I expected purgatory. That's a debt I can never fully repay, only honor through how I live. They embraced one final time, two old men who'd been given the gift of witnessing how compassion could transform history. As the train pulled away, Hans stood on the platform, waving until it disappeared from view. Walking back through his village, Hans reflected on the mathematics of human transformation that had shaped his life, when family's kindness had influenced 43 families in his cooperative. Otto's memoir had reached thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands. Wilhelm's factory had employed thousands more. Dr. Fisher's students had treated countless patients with ethics learned from American example. The ripples spread outward, generation to generation, each act of transformation multiplying into something larger than any individual could comprehend. That evening, Hans gathered his grandchildren and told them the story again, how he'd arrived in America expecting cruelty and found kindness, expected hatred and found family, expected purgatory and found paradise. He told them about the Johnson family, about American abundance and freedom, about the power of treating enemies with dignity. Remember this, he told them, his voice carrying the weight of lived experience. The greatest victories don't come through force. They come through example, through demonstrating values so compelling that even enemies cannot deny their truth. That's what America did for us. That's what we must do for others. His youngest granddaughter, barely 10, asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. Opa, were you angry when they made you leave America? Hans considered carefully, wanting to give her the truth. Yes, Liebling, I was heartbroken. But looking back, I understand now that I needed to come home. Not for myself, but to bring what I'd learned back to Germany. to plant seeds that would grow into the life you now enjoy. Sometimes the greatest gift isn't staying in paradise, it's carrying paradise with you and recreating it wherever you go. Outside, the Bavarian sunset mirrored the Iowa sunsets Hans had watched 3 decades earlier. Different continents, different circumstances, but the same fundamental truth: human dignity, kindness, and freedom were universal values that transcended borders and ideologies. The transformation begun in American captivity continued, generation after generation, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapons aren't bombs or bullets, but simple acts of human decency that echo across time. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.